You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute engineering level precision. Like you break your arm and the x-ray shows that jagged white line and the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
Right. It's binary. It's comforting because we crave that visibility. We want our internal states to be neatly categorized and physically verifiable.
Exactly. But the second you step out of the orthopedist's office and into the world of human emotion, that x-ray machine is just totally useless. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. So welcome to another deep dive. Today we're embarking on a journey that requires us to drastically slow our pace. We're taking a profound, unhurried exploration into the very fabric of our minds.
And it's a necessary pause, I think. Hello to you listening.
Yeah.
I like to view these deep dives as a kind of philosophy cafe, a shared intellectual space where we prioritize deep, deliberate reflection over the rushed, fragmented sound bites that usually dominate our days.
Yeah, it's a breath of fresh air, honestly.
It truly is. And if you find this kind of quiet intellectual rigor valuable in our increasingly noisy world, we simply ask that you support our mission here at the Philosophy Cafe by liking and sharing this deep dive with fellow curious minds. Because what we are untangling today affects absolutely everyone.
It really does. I mean, today's mission is massive. We are diving into a dense, incredibly fascinating book published in 2019 by Harvard University Press. It's written by Luke Fernandez and Susan Matt, who are professors at Weber State University. And it features this wildly provocative title, which is Bored, Lonely, Angry, and Stupid.
It is a striking title.
Right. And the core argument they present completely shatters how we think about our own heads. They argue that our emotions, our loneliness, our narcissism, our boredom are not these fixed, universal psychological states that have just existed unchanged since the dawn of humanity.
No, they argue the opposite.
Yeah, they say the very way a feeling operates inside your body is engineered and shaped and fundamentally rewritten by the technology of the era you happen to live in.
It's a staggering premise to sit with, honestly. We are deeply conditioned to view our emotions as the most organic, untampered, natural part of our humanity. But Fernandez and Matt force us to question that. A 10th century farmer experiencing loneliness or envy is feeling an entirely different physiological and psychological phenomenon than you or I today.
Even though we use the exact same word for it.
Exactly. The linguistic label remained the same, but the internal software running that emotion was patched and updated.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that software update because the book illustrates this beautifully by tracking a very specific emotion, which is envy. And the shift they describe just completely blew my mind.
It is arguably one of the clearest examples of this emotional mutation. Susan Matt actually conducted a brilliant historical analysis in a 2002 paper where she bypassed adult literature and went straight to the raw and polished psychology of the era. She looked at school children's essays.
Which is the perfect testing ground, really, because kids just parrot the moral frameworks of their parents.
Precisely. They are unfiltered mirrors of society. She examined archives of essays written by American students spanning a 40-year period right through the turn of the 20th century, so from 1890 to roughly 1930.
Wow, that's a huge sample size.
It is. And what the archives revealed was a distinct mutation in the human emotional experience, pivoting almost exactly around the year 1915. If we look at the essays from 1890 to 1915, they reflect a society operating entirely on a psychology of scarcity.
Right, because this was an agrarian and early industrial world where resources were strictly limited.
Exactly. And because of this economic reality, the physical act of showing off wasn't just considered rude, it was considered spiritually hideous.
Because life was essentially a zero-sum game. If you had a surplus of grain or, I don't know, a luxurious coat, the immediate unspoken implication was that you had deprived someone else of it.
That is the exact mechanism, yes. In a scarcity economy, envy is a toxic, malignant sin. If you coveted your neighbor's possessions, you were harboring a destructive resentment that threatened the whole social fabric. You were suffering from a spiritual sickness that had to be suppressed.
But then right around 1915, the environment undergoes a radical transformation. We see the explosion of Henry Ford's assembly line and the mass production of the automobile, and suddenly the market is flooded with consumer goods. It's the dawn of abundance.
Yes, the environment flipped from scarcity to abundance. And as it did, the emotion of envy didn't just fade away, it became the foundation of the American dream.
It's so wild to think about. It stopped being a sin.
It stopped being a sin and mutated into competitive striving. The assembly line birthed the phenomena of keeping up with the Joneses. Think about how radical that is.
It's a total 180.
If your neighbor bought a new Ford Model T, you didn't sit in the dark silently hating them and fearing starvation anymore.
Yeah.
The abundance mindset rewired the emotion to say, well, if I work an extra shift, I can have that machine too. Envy transformed from a destructive societal acid into an aspirational engine.
It's incredible when you apply that to today. I mean, think about modern social media influencers. They exist entirely to trigger this modern, mutated version of envy. We took an ugly, unmentionable sin that used to tear villages apart and turned it into the literal engine of the global consumer economy.
You monetized it.
We did. It makes you pause and wonder, like, the last time you felt envious of a colleague on LinkedIn, were you feeling a classic human emotion, or were you just running a tech-driven script designed to make you compete?
It fundamentally destabilizes how you view your own mind.
Yeah.
And if you follow that logic of self-presentation, it brings us to perhaps the most intense emotional evolution we are living through right now, which is the rise of what we diagnose today as narcissism.
Yes, let's dive into this, because everywhere you look, there's a cultural panic that we've all become raging narcissists obsessed with our own reflections. But the psychological term narcissism wasn't even coined until 1898 by Havelock Ellis.
That's right.
Before that, society didn't view intense self-focus as a mental health condition. They just called it vanity.
And we must understand that vanity wasn't just a personality flaw back then. It carried a terrifying existential weight. To grasp this picture, the 16th century Dutch Venetian paintings.
Oh, I've seen some of those in museums.
They are visually stunning. These intricate, hyper-realistic, still-life paintings. They featured beautiful objects, jewels, wine, flowers, perhaps a mirror. But placed right next to those objects of beauty was always a rotting piece of fruit, an hourglass, or a human skull.
Right, a memento mori, a reminder of death.
A severe moral warning. In that era, fixating on your own physical reflection was viewed as morbus satanicus, the sickness of Satan. It was a spiritual rot.
Wow, the sickness of Satan. That is intense.
To stare into a mirror meant you were a foolish, empty vessel, tragically obsessed with a decaying, fleeting physical world, entirely neglecting your eternal soul. Even carrying into the 19th century, talking about yourself, focusing on your appearance, or even using the pronoun I too frequently was considered the absolute most obnoxious, empty-headed thing a human being could do.
So the obvious question is, how do we get from 16th century skulls and overwhelming spiritual shame to a modern society where people casually post 20 selfies a day and it's considered totally normal, like even a healthy form of self-love? We didn't just wake up one morning and decide the skull wasn't scary anymore.
No, we did not. The book argues that this wasn't a sudden moral failing of humanity, but rather a slow erosion of stigma, driven by three highly specific technological shifts. And the first one is actually quite surprising. It's the expansion of the Postal Service in the 1850s.
I found this part of the book fascinating. We don't think of the post office as a catalyst for narcissism.
It seems entirely unrelated.
Yeah, but before cheap postage, sending a letter was incredibly expensive. You only wrote a letter if you had a royal decree, or a massive business transaction, or news of a death. But once postage became cheap and accessible to the working class, ordinary people began writing letters to their family and friends.
And when you sit down to write a letter to a friend, just to catch up, what is the primary subject matter?
You write about yourself. You literally have to construct a narrative of your own life, like, I feel this way, or I did this today. The technology of cheap paper and stamps forced humanity to practice talking about themselves.
Exactly. It democratized the sharing of the self and slowly broke down the linguistic taboo of saying I. The physical act of writing the letter built the cognitive habit of self-reflection. And the second technological shift compounded this, which was the mass production of cheap, high-quality mirrors.
Because before that, a good mirror was basically for royalty.
Right. A clear reflection of yourself was a luxury reserved for the aristocracy. Once mirrors became affordable household items every day of our, people gained the ability to constantly monitor, adjust, and fixate on their own appearance in real time.
That makes total sense.
But the third shift is arguably the most powerful, and that is the invention of photography, specifically the daguerreotype in 1839.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly deeply unsettling. When we think of early photography, we just assume people looked stiff and unsmiling because the exposure times were long. But the cultural reality of what they were photographing is much darker.
It is entirely sobering. In the 1840s and 1850s, commissioning a photograph was prohibitively expensive. An average family might only afford to have a photograph taken once in an entire lifetime. So when do you deploy this rare, seemingly magical technology?
The modern assumption would be a wedding or a birth.
Tragically, the most common subjects of early photography were dead children. Infant mortality was incredibly high, and a post-mortem photograph was often the only visual record a parent would ever have of their child before burial.
That is just heartbreaking to think about.
It was a very different world. Furthermore, the idea of smiling in a photograph was culturally non-existent until roughly 1940. If you smiled in a portrait society, assumed you were a peasant, a child, or heavily intoxicated.
Seriously, much drunk.
Yes. A photograph was a grave, solemn record of your fleeting mortal existence. Smiling meant you fundamentally misunderstood the seriousness of life and death.
It was an extension of those Dutch paintings with the skulls. The camera was a tool for immortality, not entertainment. So how did the modern toothy vacation smile get engineered?
Enter the Kodak company, specifically their marketing department for the inexpensive Brownie camera. Kodak faced a distinct corporate problem. Selling cameras solely for post-mortem solemn portraits is a very low-volume business model because a person only dies once.
But they have birthdays every single year. They take vacations every summer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Kodak launched massive, aggressive marketing campaigns designed to actively alter human culture. They retrained the public. Their advertisements essentially dictated, do not wait until tragedy strikes. Capture the living, capture their joy, capture their smiles.
It's brilliant and terrifying at the same time. Corporate marketing actively shifted our moral compass. They took the act of self-documentation, which for centuries was a grotesque vain sin, and rebranded it as an act of familial love.
That was the genius of it.
Right, they're saying you aren't being vain, you are preserving memories for your children. They essentially engineered the modern smile just to move product.
They absolutely did. And tracing that constant normalized documentation of the self brings us to a much heavier reflection on where this hyper-awareness has deposited us today. We're witnessing what researchers like Jean Twenge and IGen and Jonathan Haidt in The Anxious Generation describe as an unprecedented epidemic of youth anxiety.
Right, the dominant narrative is that smartphones and social media are destroying the youth, making them entitled and chronically anxious and completely detached. But if we apply Fernandez and Matt's thesis, it's not just the blue light from the screens causing the damage, is it?
No, it is far more profound than the screens themselves. I try to approach this with a lot of compassion, because the technology has fundamentally severed our relationship with time and mortality. To understand the depth of this anxiety, we have to look at an essay written in 1976 by Tom Wolfe called The Me Decade. Wolfe discusses a lost psychological concept known as serial immortality.
Serial immortality. Let's dig into the mechanics of that.
For the vast majority of human history, the average person did not suffer from the crushing existential dread of missing out. They didn't lie awake in an agonizing panic that they hadn't self-actualized by age 25.
Which is pretty much the default state of a 25-year-old today.
Exactly. But historically, why didn't they? Because their psychology was anchored in the comforting belief that they were merely one link in an eternal chain of ancestors and descendants. They viewed themselves as carriers of their chromosomes or stewards of the family trade. They accepted a harsh but simple truth. I will toil, I will likely suffer, and I will die. But my children and my children's children will enjoy the fruits of my labor.
Their immortality was serial. It was guaranteed by the lineage. The pressure wasn't on the individual to achieve a spectacular, globally recognized life. You just had to hold the line for the next generation.
You're protected by your place in the chain. But the modern era, accelerated by technology and the ultimate celebration of the hyper-documented self, severed those deep communal ties. Serial immortality is dead. Humanity is now burdened with a terrifying, isolating realization. I only have one life. This is it.
And that completely reframes modern anxiety. If I can take that concept and apply it to the generational friction we see today, you constantly hear older generations complaining that teenagers demand instant gratification. They vape, they stare at screens, they refuse to grind through a miserable entry-level job for the promise of a pension in 40 years.
Yes, that is a very common critique.
But if we look at it through the lens of a severed serial immortality, if the culture is constantly screaming at you that you only live once, that your lineage doesn't matter, and that this tiny 80-year window is the only conscious experience you will ever have in the history of the cosmos, then prioritizing immediate radical pleasure over long-term suffering isn't a moral failing at all.
It isn't.
It is a completely logical, rational response to a terrifying existential reality.
That is the exact compassionate framework we must apply. It is a deeply logical, albeit tragic, coping mechanism. When the chain of generations is broken, the entire burden of finding ultimate meaning, ultimate pleasure, and ultimate success rests on this one fleeting moment. That creates an agonizing, suffocating level of FOMO, the fear of missing out. It's no longer just the fear of missing a party, it is the terror of wasting your only existence.
Wow. It completely shifts how you view a teenager endlessly scrolling on a couch. You stop seeing laziness and start seeing a desperate attempt to numb an existential panic.
It requires a profound empathy, and this shift in how we perceive time leads us directly to how we experience the passage of time. Let's examine how technology revolutionized the concept of boredom.
This is another major revelation in the book, because boredom, as we know it, didn't really exist 200 years ago. If you read 19th century literature, you encounter a totally different word, which is ennui.
Right. Ennui and modern boredom are two entirely different emotional beasts driven by different environments. In the 19th century, ennui was the soul-crushing existential emptiness experienced almost exclusively by rich, idle aristocrats.
Because they had everything done for them.
Exactly. They had absolute security and absolutely nothing to strive for. As a result, they essentially rotted from the inside out, often turning to destructive vice simply to feel a pulse.
It was a luxury disease. You had to be wealthy to suffer from ennui. But then the 20th century arrives, and we get Frederick Winslow Taylor and the concept of Taylorism.
Yes, scientific management.
Right. Taylor brings stopwatches onto the factory floor. He breaks down human labor into singular repetitive motions to optimize efficiency for Henry Ford's assembly lines. A worker is no longer crafting a whole product. They are just tightening a single bolt 5,000 times a day, every single day. That environment didn't create ennui. It invented a brand new emotion, mechanical boredom.
It was an environmental fatigue. It wasn't the philosophical emptiness of an aristocrat. It was the soul-numbing physical exhaustion of a human being reduced to a biological gear.
Which perfectly sets up our modern absolute obsession with its opposite focus. Everyone today, myself included, wishes they had more focus. We buy supplements for it, we download apps for it, we diagnose a lack of focus as a disorder, ADHD. We view sustained focus as the ultimate cognitive virtue.
And here is a historical reality that completely shatters our modern assumptions. In the 19th century, extreme prolonged focus wasn't a virtue. It was considered a severe medical disease.
I had to read that section twice. Doctors genuinely believed that focusing on one thing was biologically dangerous.
They absolutely did. Medical professionals of the Victorian era believed that staring at a single task for hours on end caused a condition they diagnosed as cerebral hyperemia. The working theory was that the brain was like an engine. If you forced it into singular, rigid attention, blood would rush to the head, causing swelling, congestion, and eventual mental collapse. You know what doctors prescribe to keep the brain healthy?
Let me guess. The exact things we try to ban today.
Distraction and multitasking. Looking out the window, shifting your attention rapidly, working on multiple projects at once. That was considered the medically sound remedy to prevent your brain from literally overheating under the unnatural pressure of singular focus.
That is mind-blowing. So when did our culture pivot to demanding that focus is the holy grail of productivity?
The demand shifted in the 20th century, heavily accelerated by the post-Sputnik era during the Cold War. Suddenly, there was an intense nationalistic demand for technological and scientific supremacy. Society demanded that millions of white-collar workers sit rigidly at a desk and maintain intense, unbroken focus for 8 hours a day to win the space race and the economic war.
But human biology isn't designed for that.
It is not. So to cope with this highly unnatural cognitive demand, society had to invent a pressure valve.
Oh, this is where the concept of the modern weekend comes in.
Yes. To survive 40 hours of painful, unnatural, mandated focus, society birthed the culture of letting off steam. The rise of extreme wild partying, the explosion of frantic jazz clubs, the intense escapism of the two-day weekend, these weren't just spontaneous cultural trends. They were necessary engineered psychological release valves for a populace that was being forced into unnatural cognitive hyperfocus during the workweek.
Every action requires an equal and opposite reaction. You compress the spring all week, it has to violently decompress on Saturday, but bring that to the present day. We are currently in an era where it feels like nobody can focus at all. You constantly hear that widely shared internet fact that human beings now have an 8-second attention span, which is supposedly worse than a goldfish. Is that actually true? Like, is our biology degrading?
I am very happy to definitively debunk that myth right here. That statistic originated from a highly unscientific, widely aggregated 2015 article in Time magazine by a journalist named Kevin McSpadden. The methodology was entirely flawed. He equated the amount of time someone spends clicking around a poorly designed website before hitting the back button with their actual biological capacity for sustained attention.
That's absurd. That's like saying because I walk out of a terrible movie after 10 minutes, I have biologically lost the capacity to sit in a chair.
That is a perfect analogy. It is a false equivalency. Our brains are not degrading into those of goldfish.
Okay, well, that is a huge relief. But we can't deny the subjective experience, right? If our brains aren't biologically breaking down what is actually happening, why does it feel physically painful to sit down and read a dense novel anymore?
To understand the mechanics of that friction, we should turn to the work of technology writer Nicholas Carr, specifically his books The Shallows and The Glass Cage. Carr elegantly mourns the loss of what he calls his old brain. He uses a brilliant metaphor. He says that for most of his life he was a scuba diver. He had the cognitive ability to plunge deep into a text, submerged in profound, quiet thought for hours. But now, after decades of internet use, his brain operates like a jet ski. He is just rapidly skimming the surface of the information ocean, skipping frantically from wave to wave.
The jet ski brain. I think every single person listening knows exactly how that feels. So if our biology isn't broken, who put us on the jet ski?
The jet ski is the environment engineered by modern technology conglomerates. Giants like Google and Meta do not want you to be a scuba diver. Deep submerged focus on a single book does not generate ad revenue. It does not produce harvestable data. So they have actively weaponized distraction by building a multi-trillion-dollar economy around the eradication of something called micro-boredom.
Micro-boredom, meaning those tiny interstitial moments of daily life. The 5 seconds you wait for an elevator or standing at a crosswalk.
Precisely. The momentary lull in a conversation, the pause while water boils. Historically, these micro moments of boredom were functionally crucial. They were tiny mental respites.
It's almost like we used to have all these psychological wetlands. When the ambient stress of the day would build up, these moments of micro-boredom acted as wetlands to absorb the flood.
What a beautiful way to phrase it, yes. But today, technology actively paves over those wetlands. They sell us immediate algorithmic relief from micro-boredom. The absolute second you feel a twinge of quiet, you are rescued by a quick scroll, a push notification, a vibrant video.
You never have to be bored again.
But there is a cost. By constantly outsourcing our cognitive relief to feed our psychological endurance for tolerating quiet simply atrophies. When you finally try to sit down and read a book, the moment a complex thought requires effort, your paved over boredom wetlands flood, your endurance gives out, and you reflexively reach for the phone. You aren't intrinsically broken. You are perfectly adapting to an environment that financially penalizes your deep focus.
Wow. So pulling all of this together, what does this mean for us? If we look back at the immense journey we've taken today, from the Postal Service accidentally forcing us to curate a personality, to the Kodak company manipulating the human smile for profit, to modern social media companies paving over our psychological wetlands, the underlying truth is undeniable. Our technology doesn't just change how we communicate logistics. It actively writes the software of our internal emotional lives.
It undeniably shapes the soul. But amidst all of this, we must also remember the most comforting lesson that history provides. Humanity has panicked before. We panicked over the telegraph, we panicked over the mirror, we panicked over the camera.
And we survived.
Each time we feared the new tool would permanently shatter our humanity. Yet we adapted. We are a profoundly resilient species. The key is that by understanding these mechanisms, by naming the forces that shape us, we regain our agency. We regain the ability to choose.
Knowledge is the ultimate defense.
It is. I want to warmly thank you, the listener, for spending this time cultivating your old, deep-diving, scuba-diving brain with us today. Again, if you value this unhurried exploration, please share this Philosophy Cafe space with someone you care about so we can continue bringing calm intellectual rigor to a very distracted world.
I couldn't agree more. And before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final lingering question to ponder as you step back into the noise of your day. Think about the smartphone sitting in your pocket right now. If that piece of glass and metal is quietly rewriting what it means to feel lonely, to feel angry, or to feel happy, are the emotions you are feeling right now truly your own? Or are you just running the emotional software of the 21st century? Catch you next time.